Chapter 7, Principles of Pathophysiology. We're going to talk about the cell, regulation of homeostasis, cardiopulmonary system, shock, and pathophysiology of other systems as well. So, introduction to pathophysiology. It is the study of how disease processes affect function of body. So, COPD, CHF, AFib, VFib, all of those things that can go wrong with the body, we need to understand what is going on with the body and how it affects our patients. So that way we can recognize these changes and recognize the needs of the body to help fix it. So the cell. The cell is a membrane that protects and selectively allows water and other substances in and out of the cell. On the cell, you have your outer shell, basically, that it is like a layer, protective layer that says, hey, I am going to allow this much water in, and when I get to this much water, I'm going to stop. Or it has little receptors on the cell that say, hey, this particular hormone can come in, but this can't. So like insulin. Insulin is a key to the receptor site. So it plugs into a particular receptor site and it allows sugar or glucose to come into the cell. When the cell gets enough glucose, the insulin then says, hey, you can't come in, and it locks the receptor site. The nucleus contains the DNA and the genetic blueprint for reproduction. The endoplasmic reticulum synthesizes that protein, and then the mitochondria convert the glucose and other nutrients into ATP. Again, we produce ATP. We produce those 32 ATP through that Krebs cycle, which is just a huge cycle that turns glucose and oxygen into that ATP. And it provides fuel for cell functions, and without that ATP, the specialized structures cannot function. So this is just a picture of the cell. You've got your nucleus, you've got your membrane, your endoplasmic reticulum, your mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, going back to high school biology. So water and the cell. The cells need the correct balance of water inside and outside of the cell. If you have too little water, the cell dehydrates and dies. If you have too much water, your basic cellular function is interrupted. Water also affects electrolytes, and these electrolytes are substances that, when dissolved in water, separate into charged particles. It impacts the electrical functions as well. Glucose. So glucose in the cell, this is the basic nutrient and building block for energy in the form of ATP. The supply of insulin must match the body's glucose requirement. Oxygen in the cell. So again, we have aerobic metabolism where cellular functions using oxygen, and then anaerobic metabolism where we're not producing the oxygen that's needed and we're not creating the ATP that's needed for the cellular function. And this creates much less energy and much more waste. The body becomes acidic, and then it impairs body functions as well. The vulnerability of the cells, organs, and organ systems. So many diseases after the permeability of the membrane alter the permeability of the membrane. Ineffective cell membrane can allow substances into the cell that should not be there. Again, you have those receptor sites on the cells that are keys, and if the cell permeability of the membrane is damaged or altered because of some disease process, or something that they put into their body, like drugs, it allows those substances to enter the cell that don't need to be there. Homeostasis. So it is regulated in the brain. If you know Waterboy, you know this scene. The medulla oblongata is what regulates homeostasis. It is maintained through the nervous system, feedback, and messaging loop. And the key structures are the hypothalamus and the medulla oblongata. Your parasympathetic nervous system is that feed or breed functions. Your neurotransmitters regulate digestion and reproduction, and it reduces heart rate and blood pressure. Your sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response. It produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. It enhances the body's ability to protect itself. It increases heart rate and blood pressure. Your bronchial tubes, your airway, dilate, enabling better gas exchange. The heart pumps harder and faster, increasing blood flow to the skeletal muscle to either allow you to fight or run away. And it also protects those vital organs. And then the blood vessels constrict, allowing blood vessels to pump more blood to where it needs to go. The cardiopulmonary system, again, this is when your respiratory and cardiovascular systems work together. They bring in oxygen to the body and distribute cells to the cells, and they remove the waste products. And any breakdown can result in system failure. Once again, blood goes round and round, air goes in and out. If it doesn't, fix it. Okay, so the upper or the lower airway, this is the right primary main bronchi, your left primary main bronchi, and then it goes into smaller bronchi and then bronchioles, where it terminates in the alveoli. And this is your alveoli. These are grape-like structures surrounded by capillary beds to promote the exchange of gases. The airway, you have to have an open or patent airway for the system to function properly. Okay, if you don't have an open and patent airway, you don't have breathing. If you don't have breathing, you don't have oxygen. If you don't have oxygen, you don't have oxygenated blood to go around to the body. If you don't have oxygenated blood to go around to the body, the cells begin to die. And they accumulate that waste. Okay, so upper airway obstructions are common, typically caused by foreign bodies and infection or trauma. The lungs are part of the lower airway, and they have a tidal volume. So this is the volume of air moving in and out during each breath cycle. How much air am I taking in during each breath cycle? Your volume, your tidal volume times your respiratory rate equals your minute volume. The minute volume is the amount of air moved in and out of the lungs in 1 minute. Any change in tidal volume or respiratory rate reduces minute volume. Respiratory dysfunction occurs anytime something interferes with the minute volume. Okay, so there are a couple different types of respiratory dysfunction. We can have a disruption of respiratory control. Respirations are controlled by the medulla oblongata. So if you have a head injury, you're going to have your respirations are going to be different, and it's going to cause a disruption. Any event impacting the function of the medulla oblongata can affect minute volume, such as an infection. So meningitis can affect the medulla oblongata. Again, head injuries, any kind of drugs or toxins introduced into the body can affect the medulla oblongata and the brain. So all of this interrupts the controlled respirations that are normally there. Respiratory dysfunction, so destruction of pressure. So if a hole is created in the chest wall, the thorax, the pressures needed for breathing are disrupted. You can have air or blood accumulating in the chest cavity that also compromises respiration. Remember, we have it's a closed system. It's a negative pressure system and a positive pressure system. So if we have one of those pressure systems that is affected, where we can't breathe out or breathe in because of some type of constriction or the ability to expel the air, then it creates dysfunction. You can have a disruption of lung tissue. This can be a trauma or medical problem that can compromise the ability of the alveoli to exchange gases. CHF, COPD, all of those things can cause the alveoli to not be able to exchange gases. The less oxygen gets in, the less carbon dioxide gets out. This can result in low oxygen levels or hypoxia and high carbon dioxide levels or hypercapnia. Compensation. So when we have one of these dysfunctions is happening, the body attempts to compensate for the gas exchange deficits. Chemoreceptors detect change in the oxygen and carbon dioxide, and the brain stimulates the respiratory system to increase the rate and or tidal volume. The blood, again, we talked about this before, but the blood is plasma. It is a liquid that helps carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. Your plasma oncotic pressure are proteins in the plasma that attract water away from and around the cells and pull it into the bloodstream. And then you have hydrostatic pressure, which is when the water is pushed back out of the blood vessels towards the cells. So you have these receptors inside the plasma that says, hey, I've got too much water, I need to push it in, or I don't have enough water, I need to push it back out. Okay. You have red blood cells. These contain oxygen-carrying hemoglobin, and white blood cells that fight infection, and then platelets as well that form clots. For blood dysfunction, without enough blood, oxygen and carbon dioxide cannot be properly moved. Again, this is that ventilation perfusion match. Okay. This can be caused by bleeding, dehydration, anemia, or liver failure. The blood vessels, this is taking oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart to the capillaries, where the gas exchange takes place between the cells and the capillaries, and then it returns it to the heart for gas exchange between the capillaries and the alveoli. The need for adequate pressure to make the cycle work. You have pressure controlled by changing diameter of the blood vessels. You have stretch receptors inside your blood vessels that monitor pressure. These stretch receptors say, hey, I'm going to either make you bigger or I'm going to make you smaller, depending on what's happening in the body. And the situation that's going on. Okay. Loss of tone. So vessels can lose their ability to constrict and dilate, and then obviously the pressure drops. This can be caused by trauma, infection, and allergic reaction. So here in the picture, you have a normal vessel where the blood fills the vessel completely, and then you have a dilated vessel where the vessel is bigger than what the blood volume is. Excessive permeability, so this is when capillaries leak fluid outside of their walls. This can be caused by severe infections such as sepsis, high altitude, and other diseases. Hypertension. So in blood pressure and the vessel pressure, we have this thing called systemic vascular resistance, and this is the pressure inside the vessels. Various conditions can lead to abnormal constriction of the vessels, leading to unhealthy and high pressure levels. Okay, so obesity is one of those things. Constricts all the vessels. That says, hey, I'm not getting enough blood, so I need to constrict my vessels so that way I can supply blood to all of this fat and everywhere else. Okay. Major risk factor is stroke and heart disease as well. You can have a loss of regulation. This is when chemical messengers tell the blood vessels when to dilate and constrict. If the signals are blocked, then problems arise. The lack of sympathetic nervous system response can cause shock. The heart, on average, has a stroke volume or output of about 70 milliliters of blood per contraction. So when the blood pumps out of the ventricle, the left ventricle, into the body, there's about 70 mLs of blood per contraction. That stroke volume is based on preload. So how much blood is returning to the heart? So if we have a problem down in the bottom of the body, like the legs or something like that, where it needs more blood, say we have a gunshot wound to the femur, we're losing blood there. So we're losing blood. We're still putting out the amount of blood that it needs from the left ventricle to the body, but then it's going outside of the body by the bleeding. And so what happens is we're not getting the amount of blood return back to the heart where it needs to be. And then you also have contractility, which is how hard the heart squeezes. If the left ventricle is not contracting like it should be to push blood to where it needs to go because of VFib or some type of heart dysrhythmia or something like that that affects the ventricle, then it's not going to get to where it needs to go. And then afterload, which is the pressure the heart has to pump against to force the blood out into the system. So if there's a problem, like there's not enough blood in afterload coming into the heart, going out of the heart, then we have an issue. Cardiac output is the stroke volume, so how much volume is going out of the heart times beats per minute. So how many times the heart is beating per minute. Okay, this equals cardiac output. Normal cardiac output is about 60 to 70 for cardiac output, and that's what we want. Autonomic nervous system. So the slowing of the heart rate or decreasing of the stroke volume reduces cardiac output. Very fast heart rates reduce cardiac output, and that allows for inadequate time for the heart to refill between contractions. In pediatric kids, the infants and young children rely on the heart rate to compensate for poor perfusion. They also lack contractile muscles. They cannot regulate the force of contraction, and a fast heart rate indicates compensation. We can have mechanical problems or electrical problems. For mechanical problems, we have physical trauma, squeezing forces, or cell death, such as a heart attack. In our electrical system, this causes damage to the heart and the electrical system that allows the heart to conduct. And it causes unorganized rhythms such as ventricular fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia, atrial fibrillation. It also causes blocks in the bundles. So we can have a right bundle branch block or a left bundle branch block. You could have a complete heart block where the heart block itself is up towards the SA node. Or you can have a second degree block where it's further down, or a first degree block where it's even further down. So putting it all together, so the entire cardiopulmonary system must work together to maintain life. If you don't have life, Or if you don't have a heartbeat, you don't have breathing, you don't have life. So you got to fix those things. There must be a balance between the ventilation and perfusion for the system to work properly, that VQ match. And when the VQ ratio is disrupted, it creates a problem for the cardiopulmonary system to work effectively. Again, blood goes round and round, air goes in and out. If it doesn't, we need to fix it. Excuse me. All right, shock. So we talked about perfusion. This is the regular delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the cells that removes waste products. Hypoperfusion is the inadequate perfusion. Okay, this is shock. It breaks down in the system, has a breakdown in the system, and can result in death of the patient. There are 4 categories of shock: hypovolemic, distributive, cardiogenic, and obstructive. Hypovolemic is when there is low blood volume. This could be a low fluid volume inside the vessels, or it could be a loss of fluid volume, such as a stab wound that we're bleeding from, or a gunshot wound that we're bleeding from. Distributive shock is when we have low blood vessel tone. So the tone, the ability to constrict and dilate those blood vessels is hindered. Okay, and then cardiogenic, which is when the heart fails to pump, and then you have obstructive, which is when the blood cannot flow. Shock causes the body to adjust rapidly and attempt to compensate for the hypoperfusion. There are common predictable responses to shock. The sympathetic nervous system engages that fight or flight response. The body's adjustments will provide necessary time to self-correct and the challenge and sustain normal function. The cost of compensation is energy and oxygen, however. Recognizing compensation. So when problems arise, the body attempts to compensate. Signs of compensated shock include slight mental status changes, increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, delayed cap refill time, pale, cool, clammy skin, and also sweating. Decompensated shock occurs when the compensatory measures fail. This is characterized by decreased blood pressure and altered mental status. Irreversible shock occurs when inadequately perfused organ systems begin to die. The patient death commonly follows. Pathophysiology of other systems. So the fluid balance. The body is 60% water. It is 70% of that 60% is intracellular, and 5% is intravascular, and 25% is interstitial. When I talk about intracellular, that means it's inside the cells. Intravascular means that it's inside the vessels, and interstitial is in between. The brain and the kidneys regulate thirst and elimination of excessive fluid. The blood plasma proteins pull fluid into the bloodstream, and the cell membrane and capillary permeability regulate flow in and out. When we have fluid loss or dehydration, this is a decrease in the total water volume. Poor fluid distribution is when the water is not getting to where it needs to go. Then we have edema. This is swelling associated with the movement of water. When we talk about edema, we typically talk about edema in the lower extremities because of gravity. The nervous system. So the brain and spinal cord are well protected by bone and muscle. It's covered by several protective layers called the meninges and a layer of shock-absorbing fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. It is still subject to damage from trauma or disease. When we have nervous system dysfunction, it can be either trauma from motor vehicle crashes, falls, or diving accidents. It's basically anything that disrupts or dysfunction, that makes dysfunction to the spinal cord or the brain. Medical dysfunction includes strokes, infections such as meningitis, encephalitis, diseases such as Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS, or MS, and low blood sugar can also cause dysfunction of the brain. The endocrine system. So in the endocrine system, glands secrete hormones, and these hormones send chemical messages to the body to control body functions. Okay. If the hormones are not getting to where they need to go, then they're not going to function. Okay. Major organs of the system include the brain, the kidneys, the pancreas, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, and the adrenal glands. When we have dysfunction in this system, it is either an organ or gland problem. It is typically present at birth, or it can be the result of illness. Too many hormones, such as Graves' disease, which is too much thyroid hormone, creates problems with the heart rate and temperature regulation. Not enough hormones, typically type 1 diabetes, where there's not enough insulin. You can also have adrenal insufficiency that affects the steroid hormones such as cortisol and aldosterone. Medications that suppress the immune system suppress adrenal function. This can result if the patient stops taking prescribed steroids. That's why when a patient is put on steroids, they are tapered off of those steroids, so there's not just a rest of the adrenal system. The digestive system allows food, water, and other nutrients to enter the body. The major organs of the system are the esophagus, stomach, and intestines. When we have dysfunction in this digestive system, it impacts hydration levels and nutrient transfer. It can be from GI bleeding, it can be slow or chronic bleeding, or it can be massive with rectal bleeding and or vomiting blood. When we have vomiting and diarrhea, these are the most common digestive system disorders. It can be from a variety of causes and may result in malnutrition and dehydration. The immune system, this is responsible for fighting infection. It responds to the specific body invaders by identifying them, marking them, and destroying them. When we have a hypersensitivity in the immune system, this is called an allergic reaction. We can have allergic reaction to certain foods, drugs, and other substances. It can result in the exaggerated immune response, and it affects chemicals more than just the invader. It produces edema, results in rapid blood pressure drop, and can be life-threatening as well.